The Boast. The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council shimmered with golden light as representatives from dozens of species gathered for what was supposed to be a meeting of unity and diplomacy. Towering insectoid speakers, scaled reptilian warlords, and feathery diplomats from avian civilizations filled the chamber with an endless wave of voices. At the center stood a group of newcomers, proud and loud, their chitinous armor reflecting the council's glow. These were the Krelath, a race infamous for their arrogance, and today they spoke with the confidence of conquerors. They were recounting tales of survival, boasting of their strength, their endurance, their victories over predators that roamed their world. One by one they described beasts with jaws that could crush stone, creatures that stalked through the night with eyes burning, like fire, and swarms that devoured flesh within moments. The council listened, some impressed, others weary of the endless stories. Finally, the leader of the Krelath raised his arms high and declared they had ventured beyond their world, testing themselves against the predators of other planets and even upon one dangerous world humans called Earth. His voice echoed as he claimed that his warriors had survived the great cats of the savannah, the wolves of the northern forests, and the sharks of the deep waters. He paused dramatically and turned toward the section of the chamber where a single human ambassador stood, a lone figure draped in the dark uniform of Earth's representatives. The Krelath sneered as he asked what humanity had left to be proud of when its predators were so easily overcome. The chamber turned toward the human. He was not a warrior nor a decorated general, but rather a quiet envoy named Marcus Hale, a man who carried himself with calm dignity. For a long moment he said nothing, and the silence grew heavy. Then his lips curved into a faint smile, a smile that seemed too controlled to be friendly, too deliberate to be casual. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, but it cut through the chamber with the weight of iron. "You met the friendly ones," he said. The council erupted in murmurs, and the Krelath leader stiffened at the implication. Friendly ones. What did that mean? They had faced lions with claws like scythes, wolves that tore through bone, sharks that circled with endless hunger. What could be deadlier than those? The Krelath leader laughed, trying to dismiss the words as human pride. But the laugh lacked its earlier force. Marcus did not move from his place, did not raise his voice, but his eyes were steady and unflinching. He began to speak of Earth not as a planet of mere predators, but as a crucible of survival, a place where death came not only with fangs or claws, but in the air, the water, even the soil beneath one's feet. He spoke of storms that could flatten mountains, of insects carrying poisons that burned through veins, of invisible parasites waiting inside food and water, and of diseases that could claim millions in silence. The council grew quieter as he spoke, the weight of his words drawing them in. The Krelath shifted uneasily, suddenly less certain of their victories. They had walked among lions and wolves, yes, but had they truly understood Earth, or had they only brushed the surface? Marcus let the silence return, his faint smile still, lingering, and in that silence the Krelath felt the first stirrings of fear, a fear they had not known when they faced claws and teeth. The chamber understood now that Earth was not simply home to predators of the flesh, but to a world that shaped humanity into something far beyond prey. And this was only the beginning of his tale. Earth's true nature. The Krelath delegation shifted, uncomfortably as Marcus Hale's words lingered in the air. The smile had unsettled them, but it was his calm tone that dug beneath their armor. For the first time since they entered the chamber, their pride faltered. They had thought their claims unshakable, yet this human spoke as if their boasting meant nothing. A counselor from the avian Thrask leaned forward with curiosity, her feathers ruffled in anticipation, and asked the human to explain what he meant. Marcus bowed his head slightly and began to speak again, his voice smooth but carrying the weight of lived truth. He told them that when outsiders came to Earth, they often saw only fragments of its dangers. They saw lions that roared across the plains, bears that stalked through the forests, wolves that hunted in packs, sharks that glided silently beneath the ocean's surface. To an alien eye, these were terrifying enough, yet to humanity, they were only one part of the picture. Earth was never just about the beasts that showed their teeth. It was about the world itself. He explained that the planet was not kind, that it was never safe, that survival on Earth was a constant battle not only against animals but against the very land and sky. Marcus spoke of the deserts where the sun stripped flesh and bone in hours, where sandstorms swallowed travelers whole, where venomous serpents struck from beneath the dunes. He described the frozen wastes where temperatures plunged so low that exposed skin turned black and brittle, where storms howled for weeks, where nothing grew and yet people still endured. He told of the jungle so dense that a single misstep could lead to poison, disease, or being swallowed by the green shadows. The council members listened in silence as he painted Earth not as a planet, but as a trial. The Kryloth leader interrupted, with a scoff saying that all worlds had challenges, that they too had deserts, that they too had storms. But Marcus only shook his head and reminded them that Earth carried all of these challenges together in one relentless cycle. Where another world might have one climate, Earth had them all, and where another predator might guard a single territory, Earth bred thousands of species, each honed by evolution to survive. Humans had been born into this chaos and forced to learn how to endure every form of danger. He recounted how human ancestors had not only survived but thrived. They hunted creatures larger and stronger than themselves. They crossed ice ages. They endured plagues. They built civilizations in places where no other species could have lasted. He told them that the lions and wolves the Kryloth had faced were never humanity's greatest test. Those were visible enemies, and humans learned long ago to outthink and outfight them. The true battles were against hunger, disease, cold, and heat. It was against rivers that flooded without warning and skies that hurled fire in the form of storms and lightning. As Marcus spoke, the chamber grew darker, not because the lights had dimmed, but because the mood shifted. The counselors began to see Earth not as a world with dangerous animals, but as a force that forged its children in suffering and survival. They realized that the Kryloth expedition, which had strutted through a savanna for a few days and fought a lion or two, had never truly understood what they had stepped into. They had not endured the hunger of a cold winter, or the sickness of a poisoned wound, or the terror of a parasite creeping through the body unseen. Marcus ended with a single line that froze the Kryloth in place. He said Earth was never meant to be survived for a moment. It demanded survival every day, every hour, every breath. That was what shaped humanity. Not the roar of a lion or the bite of a shark, but the unending test of a world that never ceased to challenge its own children. And that was why humanity smiled when others bragged about surviving Earth's predators. Because to humanity, those predators were only the first chapter of a book written in blood and endurance. Predators of flesh and mind. The chamber was silent after Marcus spoke of Earth's merciless nature. The Kryloth leader no longer smirked, though he tried to maintain an air of superiority, yet there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Other council members leaned forward now, no longer listening out of curiosity but out of something sharper, a hunger for knowledge they had never considered before. Marcus paused only long enough for the silence to weigh upon them before he continued. He told them that predators were not always measured by tooth and claw. On Earth, survival demanded more than strength. The true predators were not only beasts of flesh but the trials that tested the human mind. He explained how humans were born fragile compared to lions or bears, how they lacked fangs and scales, how their bodies could break from a single blow. Yet despite this, they endured. They learned to sharpen sticks into spears, to make fire in the cold, to hunt creatures many times their size, to fight as one when alone they were weak. The strength of humanity was never in the muscle, but in the will, in the cunning that came from facing challenges that should have ended them. He spoke of the great herds of mammoths that once roamed frozen plains, towering beasts with tusks like spears. No other predator dared hunt them, yet humans did. They tracked them across ice and snow. They studied their movements. They learned to tire them, trap them, overwhelm them. He described how early hunters drove these giants into pits, how they used fire to scare them, how they turned patience into a weapon sharper than any claw. The Kryloth listened with unease, for on their world such creatures would have been worshipped as gods, untouchable and eternal. Yet here they were, prey to fragile humans who refused to yield. Marcus then turned to the oceans. He described how humans braved waters filled with sharks and storms. He told of sailors who crossed vast stretches of sea in wooden vessels, smaller than the monsters lurking beneath. He told of whalers who faced leviathans, creatures longer than cities, and how they battled them with nothing but harpoons and courage. To most species, the sea was a graveyard, yet to humans it became a path to exploration, trade, and conquest. He did not stop there. He spoke of jungles where venom dripped from leaves and snakes waited in silence. He told of humans who walked into those green labyrinths with only crude tools, who endured hunger and fever, who mapped lands where death waited at every turn. He explained that to live on Earth was to sharpen the mind as much as the body. The predators taught humans patience, strategy, and unity, and these lessons became part of their very nature. The Krelath delegation tried to interrupt, claiming that endurance alone was not greatness, but Marcus only raised his hand gently. He said endurance was only the beginning. Humanity did not stop at surviving. They became hunters of hunters. They learned to stalk wolves, to break bears, to trap crocodiles, to cage eagles. They became masters not because they were strongest, but because they never ceased to adapt. Every predator that threatened them became a teacher, and every lesson became a weapon. By now, the council was leaning in, captivated. They began to see that the human standing before them was not exaggerating, but speaking a truth carved from the history of his species. The Krelath, who had laughed at lions, now looked uneasy, as if they were realizing that the beasts they had fought were only shadows compared to the monsters that shaped mankind. And Marcus's calm eyes told them the most unsettling truth of all, that humanity had never forgotten any of these lessons, that even now in the age of ships among stars, the predators of Earth still lived inside every human heart as memory and as strength. The hidden threats Marcus allowed the weight of the silence to linger before he began again. He told them that Earth's predators were never only the creatures with fangs and claws. The greatest threats often could not be seen at all. He explained how humanity had endured wars not only against animals, but against plagues that swept through civilizations like fire. He spoke of illnesses that passed from one breath to another, sickness that could kill faster than any beast, invisible enemies that cared nothing for strength or weapons. Entire kingdoms had been reduced to ashes by diseases that struck without warning, yet still humanity endured. Where others would have surrendered to despair, humans fought on, adapting, learning, and surviving. He described the black sickness that once spread across continents, filling the air with death and silence, leaving cities empty of life. He told of families buried together, of rulers and peasants alike falling in the same way. Yet humanity did not disappear. From the ashes of every plague they rose again, stronger and more determined. They built medicine. They built knowledge. They built defenses where none had existed before. Earth itself had forced them to evolve not only in body, but in mind. Marcus's voice grew sharper as he spoke of parasites that slipped into bloodstreams, creatures so small they could live unseen for years inside the body, waiting until their host was weak before striking. He told them of worms that blinded eyes, of insects that carried fevers that boiled the skin, of fungi that rotted the body while the victim still breathed. Each of these things was a predator as real as any lion, and all of them shaped humanity's resilience. No other species had been forced to endure such constant and invisible warfare. The counselors shivered at the thought. Some whispered among themselves, uneasy at the realization that the Krelath expedition had never faced these things. They had boasted of surviving a lion's claws, but a lion could be seen and avoided. What Marcus described was far more relentless. For these enemies lived in every breath, every drop of water, every bite of food. There was no safety on Earth, only the endless demand to fight back or die. He moved on to the power of Earth's storms. He described hurricanes that tore entire coastlines apart, winds that shredded cities, waves that swallowed fleets. He spoke of lightning that split the sky open and set forests aflame, of earthquakes that shattered mountains, of volcanoes that drowned lands in fire. These were not beasts that could be slain, but forces that demanded endurance, planning, and courage. Humans had faced them for thousands of years, and instead of giving up, they built stronger, learned faster, and returned again and again. Marcus leaned forward then, and his eyes seemed to lock onto every alien in the chamber. He told them that the Kreloth had fought lions for a few days and believed themselves victorious. Yet those lions were not the deadliest predators of Earth. The truth was that humanity was shaped by countless hidden dangers, predators that never rested and never stopped. And it was because of these unseen battles that humans learned to rise each time they were struck down. He ended by saying that Earth itself was the ultimate predator, and to live there was to fight an enemy that never showed mercy. The chamber was utterly still. The Kreloth leader clenched his mandibles but did not interrupt. Deep inside he knew that his people had never endured what the human described. The counselors too began to realize that Earth was not just another world, but something more, a crucible of endless survival. And for the first time, many of them looked at Marcus not as a simple envoy, but as the voice of a species forged in a war without end. Humanity's apex status, Marcus did not allow the silence to fade before pressing on. He told them that lions and wolves were never the true masters of Earth, because Earth's real apex predator was humanity itself. The council members straightened at those words as if they had been struck, for it was one thing to survive predators, and another to become one greater than all. Marcus explained how fragile humanity appeared to outsiders, yet how their fragility had been turned into a strength that allowed them to dominate every landscape. He spoke of how humans learned to stand together when alone they would have been easy prey. He described hunters who worked as one body, driving beasts into traps or wearing them down until exhaustion delivered victory. Where the lone predator relied on muscle and instinct, humans relied on patience, planning, and unbreakable will. He told of persistence hunters who chased animals for days without rest until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. He explained how fire became not only warmth but weapon, how stone became blade, how poison was drawn from plants and turned against enemies. Marcus described how humanity spread across Earth. No land was too harsh, no sea too vast, no mountain too high. Where deserts burned, humans carried water. Where ice ruled, they wrapped themselves in furs and built fires that lasted through the night. Where rivers raged, they built boats and learned to ride the currents. Every obstacle that should have destroyed them instead became a lesson, and every lesson was carved into their nature. Slowly they ceased to be the hunted and became the hunters of everything that once terrified them. He told of how humans hunted wolves until the wolf's howl became a sound of respect rather than fear. He told of how bears that once prowled alone were brought down by groups armed with nothing more than sharpened wood. He told of how humans entered caves where predators had ruled and made them into homes filled with firelight and laughter. The Kreloth delegation could no longer meet his gaze because they began to realize that their own triumphs over lions and sharks were nothing compared to a species that had turned those same predators into trophies, allies, or food. Marcus raised his hand and continued. He said that humanity's true weapon was not their bodies but their minds. They learned to study the world with eyes sharper than any eagle. They learned to strike with precision rather than brute force. They learned to bend nature itself to their will. Forests were cut and reshaped into tools and shelters. Rivers were dammed and turned into lifeblood for cities. Animals that once threatened them were domesticated, turned into companions and laborers. Humanity reshaped its predators and its world until neither ruled over them. The chamber was silent again, but this silence was different. It was not born of disbelief, but of realization. Many council members understood now why Marcus had smiled when the Kreloth had boasted. They saw that humanity had never been defined by surviving predators but by surpassing them. Every creature that had once stood above them had been brought down or tamed. Every challenge that should have ended them had become the fuel that pushed them forward. Marcus finished this part of his address with a simple truth. He said that humanity had been tested by Earth itself, and in every test they had not only endured, but claimed victory. They were no longer prey. They were no longer equals to the predators of their world. They had become the apex, the species that all others had to reckon with. And in their rise they carried the lessons of every danger they had ever faced. Lessons that made them something no predator could ever defeat. The Kreloth sat in silence now, their pride stripped away, They had believed themselves superior for surviving Earth's surface predators, but now they realized that those beasts were never the real threat. The real threat was the species that had risen above them, the species that stood in the council chamber with calm eyes and a faint smile. Humanity. The warning Marcus stood firm as the weight of his words pressed against every corner of the chamber. The Kriloth no longer smirked, and their once proud postures sagged as though the tales they had carried for so long had been turned into empty echoes. Yet Marcus was not finished. He leaned forward slightly and his voice dropped lower, forcing every ear to strain for the words that followed. He told them that what the Kriloth had faced were the predators that allowed themselves to be seen, the beasts that tolerated visitors, the creatures that might show mercy through fear or curiosity. Then his gaze sharpened, and he reminded them of what he had said before, that they had only met the friendly ones. Confusion rippled through the council until Marcus began to reveal the predators that no alien had ever met and lived to speak of. He spoke of the deep oceans that stretched darker than any starless void. He told them of creatures that glowed in the dark waters, teeth longer than a man's arm, bodies armored with plates harder than metal, predators that devoured each other, in silence and shadows. He described swarms of piranha that could strip flesh from bone in minutes, jellyfish whose touch could stop a heart, leviathans that swallowed ships whole without leaving a trace. The Kriloth who had bragged of lions looked pale now, for their brief expedition had never dared enter Earth's seas. Marcus did not stop there. He moved to the swamps and rivers where crocodiles waited without moving for days, patient killers that lunged with the strength of a falling boulder. He spoke of insects that moved in countless numbers, ants that could consume anything in their path, locusts that turned green lands into deserts overnight. He told of spiders whose venom burned, the blood of scorpions that stung without warning, of hornets that killed not with one strike but with relentless swarms. The chamber grew colder as he listed them, not with the voice of a storyteller but with the certainty of someone who carried the memory of his world within him. Then Marcus turned to the land itself. He said the ground could open and swallow entire villages, that mountains could roar with fire, that storms could shatter the works of thousands in a single night. He described floods that drowned whole nations and droughts that turned rivers to dust. To live on Earth was not only to survive beasts, but to survive the world itself, a world that seemed to enjoy testing the limits of those who lived upon it. And humanity had endured all of it. Finally, his eyes fell directly upon the Kriloth. He told them that when they faced lions and wolves, they had faced predators that humanity had long ago learned to master. They had not faced the terrors that never showed mercy. They had not faced the endless hunger of the swarm, the sting of venom too small to see, or the silent killer that crept through the blood. He warned them that if ever they thought they had conquered Earth, they would be wrong, for Earth was not theirs to conquer. Only its children had ever been shaped enough to survive it, and even they carried the scars. The council chamber was so silent that even the faint hum of the great lights above seemed deafening. Marcus's warning did not sound like a threat, and yet it carried the weight of one. It was not the roar of a predator, but the quiet truth of someone who knew the depths of danger and spoke it plainly. The Kriloth shifted uneasily, and for the first time since they had entered the council chamber, they looked less like warriors and more like prey. The revelation in Marcus stood still at the center of the chamber, and though his voice had been calm, the atmosphere was tense enough to crush the pride from every delegate present. The Kriloth, who had arrived with raised chins and swelling pride, now avoided his gaze, their mandibles tight with unease. The other council members waited, leaning forward, breath held, because they knew the story was not finished. Marcus took his time before he spoke again, letting silence build until even the hum of the lights above sounded like thunder. He reminded them that the Kriloth had measured their bravery against lions, wolves, and sharks, and believed themselves victorious. But he asked them what it meant to boast of one hunt, when humanity had endured countless hunts every day for thousands of years. He told them that the predators of Earth never ceased and never allowed rest. He explained that humanity had been forged not in moments of glory but in generations of relentless trial, sharpened again and again until nothing could truly break them. He described how humans became the architects of their own fate, They built weapons not only to defend themselves but to extend their reach further than any claw could strike. They mastered fire and steel and later machines that could soar through skies and dive beneath oceans. He told of wars where humanity fought not against beasts but against itself. Battles that tore nations apart, and yet even those struggles taught them new lessons of endurance and strength. What other species could survive not only the wrath of their planet, but the fury of their own kind and still continue to rise higher? Marcus's tone grew sharper. He said the Kreloth had claimed to know Earth's predators, but they had not met humanity when it was cornered. He told them that the same instincts that allowed a fragile child to face lions had grown into instincts that guided fleets and armies across the stars. He warned them that when humanity faced an enemy, they did not simply fight. They adapted, they learned, and they grew stronger with every battle. To challenge humanity was to face not only the predators of Earth, but the reflection of every danger Earth had ever created. The council chamber was heavy with fear now. Some leaned back in their seats as if trying to distance themselves from the words. Others leaned closer as if compelled despite themselves. The Kreloth leader trembled with rage but could find no answer, because every tale he had carried had been stripped bare of meaning. What was a single lion compared to a species that had turned storms, plagues, and giants into stepping stones? Marcus allowed the silence to stretch once more, before he delivered his final words. He said that when the Kreloth had walked the plains of Earth, they had been fortunate because the creatures they met had allowed them to leave. He repeated the phrase that had begun this exchange, but now his voice carried the weight of truth rather than suggestion. You met the friendly ones. Then he leaned forward slightly and whispered that if they were ever to meet the unfriendly ones, they would not be here to tell the tale. The chamber erupted into silence deeper than before, a silence born not of confusion, but of fear and understanding. The Kreloth bowed their heads, their pride broken. The council members looked upon Marcus Hale not as a simple envoy, but as the voice of a species shaped by trials no other could comprehend. Humanity was no longer seen as fragile or insignificant. They were predators raised by a world that had no mercy and no end to its tests. And as Marcus turned and walked away, his faint smile lingered, leaving every alien in the chamber with a truth they would never forget. Earth did not raise prey. It bred predators who had learned from every shadow, every claw, every unseen enemy. To face humanity was to face the unfriendly ones. The human truth. The Galactic Council had expected another day of speeches filled with pride and boasting, but instead they had witnessed something that would be spoken of for centuries. Marcus Hale had not raised his voice or lifted a weapon, yet every word he had spoken had landed heavier than steel. The Kreloth delegation sat hunched over their arrogance, stripped away, their victories turned into hollow echoes of ignorance. They had believed they had conquered Earth for a moment, but now they understood they had merely brushed against its surface and been allowed to walk away. Marcus stood calm and steady, his figure small compared to many of the towering species in the chamber, but his presence filled the hall. He told them that humanity was not shaped in peace but in endless trial. He said that Earth had been both cradle and crucible, and every force of nature had been hammer and flame. He reminded them that while they saw lions and wolves, humanity had faced starvation, disease, storms, and darkness, and from those battles humanity had risen sharper than any fang, stronger than any claw. He spoke of how humans had always turned danger into teacher. The mammoth that could have crushed them became food for villages. The venom that could kill became medicine in careful hands. The fire that could destroy forests became a tool to light homes and forge blades. He said no predator had ever remained supreme on Earth because humans never stopped learning and never stopped adapting. That was why they were not prey and not equal, but something greater than all that Earth had thrown at them. Marcus then gave his last words, and his voice was soft but carried like thunder. He told them the Kreloth had been fortunate. They had faced lions that roared to warn them and wolves that hesitated to strike, but they had not faced the ones that did not allow escape. They had met only the friendly ones. Then his gaze hardened and he said, if they ever met the unfriendly ones, they would not live to tell it. The silence that followed was unlike any that had filled the chamber before. It was not the pause of thought or the stillness of respect. It was fear. Every delegate present understood that the human had revealed a truth larger than pride or warning. He had shown them that humanity was not a species that begged for recognition. They were predators raised by a world that had no mercy and no forgiveness. Marcus turned and walked from the center of the chamber. He did not look back. He did not need to. His smile lingered in their minds long after his steps faded. The Kryloth who had once laughed at Earth now sat trembling with the weight of what they had learned. The Council knew that they would never again look at humanity the same way. Earth did not raise prey. Earth bred predators who became masters of survival, and humanity carried that truth into the stars as the warning and the promise of their kind. The end.